And that's how I started the work I was doing, looking at individuals, recognizing too that most of medicine is one size fits all.
A lot of people, they think of gene and DNA as a recipe. You have a list of things that will be expressed, and once you're imprinted with those, that's all you're going to get. But in reality, it's more like a set of codes that gets turned on or off. And what's the difference between antibiotic steroids and these peptides that people actually use to improve health?
Steroids is a whole other class of drugs that do a lot of damage in the body.
How to improve testosterone levels.
I've seen men with the same low testosterone, and one is full speed ahead sexually, and the other one cannot function. And so it depends on where they started too.
All 8 billion of us are doing metabolism at all times. This show is about learning what metabolism is, how it affects you in every way possible, from mood and mental state to performance and energy. We are all about fine-tuning the human experience for you to achieve the best self you can be. And if you are someone who loves science, curious to know how your body works and how to optimize it, then you are in the right place. This is the H.V.M.N. podcast. In this episode, we have Dr. Florence Comite, who is a clinician scientist and innovator in the field of precision medicine. In 2005, Dr. Comite founded the Center for Precision Medicine and Health in New York City, where she established a clinically proven academic approach to personalized healthcare structured as clinical trial. By integrating and interpreting genomic, metabolomic, phenotypic, and digital health data, the center provides predictive analysis and actionable guidance for the individual patient. Dr. Comite's startup Grok Health, a mobile app with science-backed and AI and ML-based systems to identify treatment and lifestyle changes to reverse and prevent diseases of aging, scales her unique approach to personalized, actionable precision medicine as a digital application. Dr. Comite is a graduate of Yale School of Medicine, where she was also a faculty member for 25 years with a triple appointment in endocrinology and reproductive endocrinology. Dr. Comite also trained at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development of the NIH, and in 1992, Dr. Comite founded Women's Health at Yale. In this episode, we spoke about longevity and the risk of chronic diseases and how precision medicine can not only slow down but reverse aging. She also made the bold claim of her belief that we can live a life free of chronic disease for the entire life. So I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I have, and stay tuned. And we have Dr. Florence Comite today on this episode of Health via Modern Nutrition podcast. Thank you very much for coming on. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it, Latt.
Yeah. So right before we were pressing recording, we're talking about where we're based, New York. It's pretty cold right now, right?
Pretty cold. Today, really, the temperature just dropped and I had to wear a down jacket, which was cool. I like seasons. So having spent a lot of time on your coast, because I was bi-coastal years ago when I was still at Yale, and then now more recently since COVID, actually, I think I like the real seasonal changes.
That's, I love seasonal changes because I come from Malaysia. So it's a tropical country. We only have like rainy season and more rain kind of season.
I was in Malaysia years
Were
ago.
you?
I was invited to Pangor Laut, which is one island, resort.
In the same state that I live in.
Yeah. And I went like for a long weekend, believe it or not. It was a long trip for a long weekend. It was the best thing I ever did because they had a spa and a health there. And it was a gorgeous place with peacocks running around and monkeys stealing your lunch and everything. And they were interested in how I approached health because I had established what I did in California at Ojai Valley Inn and Spa while I was still at Yale.
It's very interesting. We're going to be having a H.V.M.N. retreat at Ojai Valley Inn next week.
Oh my God, I love Ojai. I was there for 2 or 3 years and it was hugely successful. It's owned by the Crown family. They had built the spa, but the golf was fabulous. It's a short course, but it's still like it's been used by senior PGA, but they couldn't get the 5 stars, and the Crowns wanted the 5 stars because it was their favorite resort. So they shut us down. It was supposed to be 6 months. It ended up being 2 years. I decided I'd go straight to New York because I was still in New Haven. And so I know, oh, it's my favorite resort in the world. I love that
And
place.
this is a great segue to tell us more about your background and your story, right? Because you have such an interesting story and such a wealth of expertise and experience in health and wellness world. So please share with us what your background story is.
Yes, thank you for asking about what led me to where I am today. And it really started over 2 decades ago at Yale. I gave a journal club because I had an appointment in 3 different departments. So, speak about being a geek. I was trained in every decade of life in endocrinology, hormone metabolism, from pediatrics, actually from fertility, so in utero, to pediatrics, all the way through menopause and andropause in men. And when I went back to Yale from NIH, where I had been in medical school at Yale and then trained for a couple of years and went to NIH for my fellowship, I was fortunate enough to be exposed to every kind of endocrine system, working with side by side with OBGYN, urology, medicine, pediatrics. And as a result, I had this perspective that as we age every decade of life, our body changes, but we don't necessarily see it until we get sick. And getting sick happens decades after these changes begin to evolve. So it started way back then with a journal club where I described how in the 30s, our bodies begin to fail and we have lots of excuses. Even if we know, even if we're an athlete, maybe we're working too hard, we're not getting into the gym, we're raising a family. But the truth of the matter is metabolism really begins to deviate from what we were considered in our prime in our 20s. And not everybody. So one of the other principles here is I was born an identical twin. And I knew right from the beginning that my twin and I were not identical. Even though our genes, we started with the same egg and sperm, which split, but then the impact on your body and how you express genes, even in utero, comes from where you live and your environment and how you're nourished. So twins, even identical twins, can be very different. And in recognizing that, I decided that while genetics was coming into its being about 20 years ago, and they described the full genome, really I wanted to start with metabolism and the dynamic changes in the body that relate to sleep, relate to the way we eat, working out, restorative practices, and ultimately look at how the changes that we see at a metabolic level, be it carbohydrate metabolism, lipids, all the different hormones, every single one in men and women. And that's how I started the work I was doing, looking at individuals, recognizing too that most of medicine is one size fits all. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, and what you talked about, your twin is a very great point and a great evidence to for people to understand what DNA is, what genes are, right? A lot of people they think of gene and DNA as a recipe. You have a list of things that will be expressed, and once you're imprinted with those, that's all you're going to get. But in reality, it's more like a set of codes that gets turned on or off, turns up or down depending on what you give your body in terms of stresses, nutrition, environment, etc., etc. So I think this is a great way of educating people how genetics work. Even though we have the gene that's why when you hear scientists and geneticists talk, they talk about expression of genes. It's not necessarily um just because you have the gene that you automatically have that phenotype. You need that gene to be expressed, and in order to express that, especially when it comes to metabolic health as well, it's a lot to do with the promoters that are linked to that specific gene that turns on and off that gene. So just a little bit of clarification there for people to understand a little bit deeper.
Oh, beautifully said. You actually stole my next line because the field of epigenetics is what caught my interest based on the fact that my twin and I have different kind of lives. And even though we can show up dressed exactly the same way without conferring with each other, I knew the minute she went into labor with her first child, and she knew the minute I did. And I was like 3 weeks late and she was a day early. And we just have a sense of each other. I think that's very powerful. Epigenetics means you have control over your health. Those switches and promoter genes and genes that shut on and off can be encouraged to do so. And that's exactly the core of my work. I look at people through the lens of, we'll see where you are now and what changes can we make? How can we guide you in partnership so that you can own your future health trajectory by the way you live, and you can extend your health span to match your lifespan, and in fact, think of it as healthy longevity. But it's based in data. So the field to me is precision medicine, because the precision brings data to what I always thought of as a personal practice. Medicine is personalized. Otherwise, you can't be a doctor or a other clinician, whether you're a physician associate or you're a nurse practitioner. You need to be personal with that human being. But unfortunately, we tend to put people in similar boxes because we think we have limited choices. We don't really know their genes and how they're expressing them. And that's exactly the target I designed over 20 years ago. And today, it's actually, I put it into action because we can actually look at 1,700 gene variants and figure out if you are good at detoxing or not, or you are higher risk for celiac even without the genes, or inflammation. And what are the steps we can put in place, be it the way you live life and your habits and your sleep or not sleeping, or supplements or medication. So to me, there's a spectrum of the way we can live life healthy, and getting that knowledge, that internal knowledge about how your body is functioning at a metabolic level, at a cellular level, beneath the surface, with hormones and all the rest, allows us to change your future health trajectory so you don't have to express chronic disease.
This is so well said. You basically comprised everything that we're going to talk about today. Like I'm almost running out of questions here because you cover it so well, and it's really nice to see how to listen to how you put it all together in a big picture on how we are going from a very micro DNA level all the way to a systemic level where it impacts our body and symptoms manifestation. And I think you hit the bullseye there, where you talk about how current healthcare system is treating a bunch of symptoms as a group rather than treating people specifically.
Exactly. So I'm sure we'll enjoy the rest of this because I feel like we speak the same language, and that's hard to do because what what we've been doing here for over 20 years is collecting data longitudinally on each individual to be able to profile how our bodies respond and what they're acting like in today's world and into how you're living today, with the intent to say, let's take control in partnership. So as you age chronologically, you actually get younger biologically, and disease never expresses itself. So I have data that absolutely irrefutably shows that we've reversed diabetes, heart disease. We've put a stop to cancer. We're always looking and curating for the tools that will make a difference for each person.
Now, this is a very interesting topic, right? You mentioned reversing biological age. So I've heard a lot about slowing it down, kind of making sure that you live a higher quality life. But in terms of reversing itself, what sort of data do you have to show the reversal of biological age?
So basically, we've been looking at biological age since 2009. I'm not sure how familiar you might be with Stephen Horvath, who originally described the aging clock,
Yes.
really based on chronological age. But since then, there's been a lot of growth and development in the field. And we work with people who are top in the field, and they've actually just come out with, I think, the defining study on biological aging. So most of the biological clocks, in fact, I believe Tally is one of them by David Sinclair, are really chronological age. But my belief is that chronological age can come and go. And my hope is we'll all live in great shape till 150 or at least 120. But the real aging happens biologically. And if we can keep ourselves younger, meaning we don't age 1 year for 1 year, but let's say we age a half a year for 1 year, or even less, we are slowing down the aging process, and aging itself is the risk factor for chronic disease. So if we start in the 30s, where I mentioned the Journal Club, and I said, Why do men get heart attacks in their 30s, women maybe 10 years later? And that has to do with hormones, by the way, usually estrogen, and also, of course, genetics and the way people live life. Osteoporosis is the reverse. Women tend to express it sooner. And that has to do with the makeup being different between men and women. But how do we stop aging, physiologically speaking, to retain and regain what we are like in our 20s, which is when we tend to be at the peak of our health? That's when procreation is best and easiest. And so there's a lot of ways to point that out. Athletes usually excel in their 20s, and it's, I think, an average age of 27. Of course, I'm generalizing. And one of the other biggest aspects of what I think we will be able to contribute, and we are in the center for now, in the bricks and mortar, but I'm moving it to a virtual setting to hopefully benefit everyone, is that I believe that it's possible to avoid chronic disease for your lifetime and basically age in great health, as long as you're aware and cognizant of the factors that drive your health, from gene variants to the switches to the way we live life.
This is a very bold claim, bold statement that you just said. I believe that you can avoid chronic diseases for the entire lifetime. Because as we said, earlier, as we age, we increase the risk of chronic diseases. So can't wait to listen to what you guys are doing there. But before we go there, I don't believe we have introduced your center formally. If you would like to talk about, what your center is, what it's called, where it's based, I think people would love to find out more about them.
Sure. So I created the Comite Center for Precision Medicine and Health, which I'm thinking of actually changing to precision medicine and longevity because people relate to that. A number of years ago in New York, about 20 years ago now. And in order to design a forward-thinking prospective trial, because you mentioned research too. So my background is as a clinical scientist. I did a lot of research in children, men and women using peptides, analogs of certain secreted hormones in the brain, from the hypothalamus and pituitary to the gonads, where we help to look at children going through puberty too early or too late, and men and women having issues with hormones. So that's a very deep field from NIH, where I was
Sort of
working
growth
as a
hormone
fellow.
releasing peptides or growth
Hormone releasing, gonadotropin releasing hormones, looking at peptides that relate to that, for example, amiprelin or CJC 1295,
which I've used.
And how they can, yes, you have?
Yeah, I have used it, yeah.
Interesting. I'd love to hear your experience. Both of them together actually have a signature that triggers similarly to the path of growth hormone. So we use it extensively for a lot of reasons: loss of fat, increased muscle, better sleep, deeper sleep. So there's a lot of ways to make use of it, and I've done a lot of testing with it as well.
So that's the first thing that I noticed. It was the sleep quality. The first night I've used it, it was really that sleep quality, that deep sleep that I experienced.
Wow. So happy to hear that, because I've been on other podcasts, and while people knew about hormones and peptides, they really didn't have really personalized experience to speak to. But we heard that in about 30% of participants in the original protocol that I set up, that people who were having trouble sleeping, they called me almost the first night and said, I can't believe it. My sleep is completely different. In fact, I use it every night, along with another peptide you've probably heard of, BCP 157, which we call prime body protection, because it works in amazing ways. And it's like 200 years old. It was discovered 200 years ago in Russia through gastric juice excretions from dogs.
Yes, and we produce BCP in our gut, so it's not a completely like new synthetic molecule that has side effects. And a lot of people are mixing up these peptides with anabolic steroids.
Oh, well, that's not a good thing.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? So a lot of people don't understand that. Could you give us a little bit of an explanation? What's the difference between anabolic steroids and these peptides that people actually use to improve health?
Steroids is a whole other class of drugs that do a lot of damage in the body. Now, they can be, we probably all heard of regular steroids like prednisone or dexamethasone. And they play a role, but I have to say, I'm an unusual endocrinologist. I'm an endocrinologist who minimizes the use of steroids because of the damage it does beyond just suppressing symptoms. So it's wonderful to take care of some inflammation. And if somebody has a very severe bee bite and they're allergic and could be anaphylactic, or they have a severe respiratory infection, a short course of steroids could be helpful, but beware of bone loss, beware of other impacts. Anabolic steroids are a whole other class, and they are extremely dangerous. They undermine the lipid system. I've seen many people who think they're doing the right thing by getting drugs at gyms and using what they think their trainers are doing, when in fact it makes them extremely healthy. It wipes out all the good cholesterol and destroys, your bad cholesterol. So you are much sicker. And so I strongly discourage the use of it. We can tell in the data when somebody has been using it. And even mega doses of testosterone, which is we use routinely, both human chorionic gonadotropin, simple peptide hormones are protein hormones that are strings of amino acids, just like peptides. And they work usually in synergy with the body. Now, there could be all sorts of effects, so one has to be familiar with why you're implementing them. But that brings me all the way to Ozempic, semaglutide, and trizazepide, because Mounjaro and Ozempic and Wegovy are also peptides that work in sync with the body if you know what you're doing. And that's the biggest fear I have, that a lot of folks are using these agents and they're getting them in ways that may not be straightforward. And as a result, it can undermine their health as opposed to support their health.
Exactly. I literally made a whole video on Ozempic just on my Instagram, and I released it because it was just more of an information, if anything, to for people to understand. Because if you go to their website, you can see the list of side effects and all of that. And it is a drug that is originally invented to treat diabetes. And, for people who are struggling with like severe weight gain and really having high risk of developing cardiovascular disease anytime soon, like that drug is a good tool. But otherwise, using it, like you said, first of all, possessing it from unknown sources, and then secondly, using it while you are actually healthy and you're capable of losing that weight by healthier means, it just increases your risk of the side effects of the drug, because they have shown that it is dose and duration dependent in terms of side effects with Ozempic.
It can be. Let me share my experience with it, because I may have a slightly tilted version being an endocrinologist. I think you're right. There are lots of ways to try to adjust our truncal fat, which accrues beginning usually in our 30s and 40s and continues from there until you get to 70. And then being too thin is a risk factor, actually, after 70. But what I like about semaglutide and also the combination in Mounjaro, which has two different peptides, is that it does mimic what the body does. And if you're using it in the proper context, meaning it needs to be used when we know we're going to put on muscle, when we're going to eat right, eat enough protein so that you're able to build muscle, you're going to avoid sarcopenia of aging. And sarcopenia is why aging is the major risk factor for disease. So that's why uncovering exactly what drives a person beneath the surface and looking at each human being as through a unique lens. Now, it's not like each of us lives on an island alone and is exactly different. That's actually an oxymoron, but is different than everybody between us. But the truth of the matter is the way we express our genes, the epigenetics, is critically important. And even if you have an identical twin sister, for example, my sister can take certain medications like metformin that I can't. We have insulin resistance. We needed some form of treatment. Hemoglobin A1C was less than 5, which is what we strive for, but fasting insulin was high. And that's a definite indicator of future disorder of carbohydrate metabolism. In other words, diabetes. But I actually have moved away from the term diabetes type 2 because to me it's a misnomer, where there's lots of forms of diabetes. People from Asia and Pakistan appear very differently when they're diabetic. They actually can look fantastic on the outside, but they're not necessarily healthy on the inside. Whereas Caucasians, Hispanic, and Black people tend to put on more weight. So erroneously, diabetes has been mixed up with obesity, and in the functional medicine world, they call it diabesity. Yeah, diabesity. So to me, we have to make sure that we drill down into who you are as a specific human being, because Ozempic, Wegovy, which has actually been approved for weight loss, as long as you maintain muscle, you actually can improve your future expression of disease by stopping disease in its tracks. Of course, with other methodology, like what kind of resistance training are you doing? Are you doing high intensity interval training? Do you have enough aerobic? What's the food? Are you eating enough protein? Are you limiting the combination? All of which we can get insights now today, for example, using wearables like continuous glucose monitoring.
Now, what about going off of Ozempic? So let's say, you use it, you lose the weight. Can you go off of it, and will you gain back the weight?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've had cases of people, very common disorder, metabolic syndrome, where some of these women and men know that they couldn't eat everything they wanted to. They had carb cravings from the time they were little children. And I'll tell you the story of a real patient who's part of a clan of Sephardic Jews. So it's very common in Mexicans, Sephardic Jews, Mediterranean in general, but it can affect one child in a family and not the other two, because it's based on how the genes come together from mom and dad, and then how you personally express them, or the individual. So you can have two children that live the same life as the third one, but even as little children, that one little person cannot lose weight and craves carbs to the extent it's not healthy, even if you're not a clinician in the family. And I've treated many such cases. And so you can use these drugs for short periods of time to help people understand what being satiated feels like, to help them lose the fat and emphasize muscle. But you need to have the whole picture in mind, not just throw one medication, even if it's a peptide, which we all love, at a person. But you need to understand the drivers and the factors that make each person unique. And I've had this individual that I was talking about was the mother of 4 by the time I met her. She came to see me. Other of her relatives had seen me. And she told me from the age of 9, she couldn't eat normally. In fact, she's already run 50 marathons. That's how much she worked out every single day for hours. And she wouldn't go out to restaurants with her family. And within a couple of years, and this predates Ozempic, but it's a similar class, Victoza. It started with a drug you had to take before a meal called Byetta. And then it advanced to a drug you would take daily, like Victoza is a good example of it. And within 2 years of staying on this drug, she lost her desire to eat carbs insatiably, and we were able to wean her off of the medication. Lots of people can come off of it because sometimes it's getting a handle, particularly if it's for aging. So if we see people in their 30s and 40s who are doing everything right, and that that's the case, and you look at it with every angle, and you actually look at all the biomarkers under the surface, and I can speak more to biomarkers as well, scientifically speaking, they need help sometimes, and giving them that jump start is magical. So I use the tools that are appropriate and safe, not snake oil. I think there's a lot of snake oil out there, or just using it because celebrities use it. It won't work and it won't stick, so that's important to know.
Yeah, for sure. I think choosing the optimal tool, having the sustainability of a lifestyle, and also not hating yourself while doing it. I think that's essentially psychologically,
Psychologically,
I think that's the most
exactly.
important. And just to backtrack a little bit as well, just for the audience, sarcopenia, to remind you guys, is essentially muscle loss related to aging. So as we age, we will sort of muscle atrophy, especially if we do not incorporate resistance exercise in it. In my master's, I actually wrote my thesis on exercise as an intervention against sarcopenia. So it
Wow.
was interesting that you brought that up. And interestingly enough, at that time, I don't know if there are any newer studies. Obviously, that has been like 15 years ago. At that time, I found out during my thesis research that aerobic exercise, like cardio, running, doesn't actually help preventing sarcopenia as much as resistance exercise. Is that still the same understanding right now?
Absolutely. And so we have people who do phenomenally well aerobically because we do testing that includes
Right.
VO2 max, where we're looking at how the heart's functioning, how the pulmonary, how you respond to a direct need for power, which is a very important thing, and why high intensity interval training or HIIT is so critical to add, even if it's just taking a quick run as you're walking, run for like 20, 30, 50 seconds. And so sarcopenia comes about because we tend to lose testosterone in our 30s. And as we lose testosterone, the three major factors besides eating enough protein and having and doing resistance exercises to build muscle, because you burn muscle while you do aerobic exercise. And so the critical thing is making sure that your body is in balance, and that the three things are adequate testosterone, particularly free testosterone, which I believe should be in men over 180 free to 250, and in women between 6 and 30, depending on the particular makeup, having enough protein, and also resistance exercises. So we've had a case, a lovely gentleman who has early heart disease in his uncles, and his mother is even a doctor. And he was trying to do everything right, and actually mainly just doing aerobic. In fact, his VO2 was one of the highest, second to the highest. The only one that was higher was a 23-year-old, and he was close to 50, and it was 68, which is almost unheard of. We're happy if it's in the 40s for somebody in the 40s. And so the minute we added resistance training and improved his testosterone and his pattern, because with early heart disease or stroke in the family, there's a very good risk, a high risk, that you can follow in that path, and the biomarkers will show me. So as soon as he implemented that, within 3 to 6 months, he was healthier than ever. His percent body fat went to 11%. He cut down all the running he was doing. He added resistance training. We made sure with human chorionic gonadotropin that his testosterone increased, his own testosterone. It triggers natural testosterone release in men who are not yet in male menopause or andropause. And so when I think about aging, sometimes the simplest thing I say to an individual who may not be medically inclined and doesn't want to hear the medicine is that keep your muscle. Sarcopenia is dangerous to health, because you know better than I, given your thesis, that if you look at cancer, end stage cancer, or you look at AIDS, cachexia, or wasting, muscle wasting, is what allows diseases to penetrate. And early on, before we really knew what AIDS was, these bizarre diseases kept happening because the body wasn't protected with enough muscle or enough fat. So there is danger in not just being skinny fat, meaning you have extra fat but you look good, but you really need muscle, but being skinny. So I know I've gone on in a certain direction, but that is so critical to health, not becoming sarcopenic.
I get to interview all these doctors, scientists, and cool people in this health and fitness industry, all made possible because of this podcast that is funded by the company I work for, which is Health via Modern Nutrition, or H.V.M.N. And it is not that they pay me to do this, but I genuinely love and believe in the product Ketone-IQ. I use it every day before my podcast, before my workout, or even after my workout for recovery. There hasn't been a single supplement that can give me such a drastic change in subjective feel within minutes as much as Ketone-IQ has. For those of you who do not know me, I'm from Malaysia, I got my PhD from the UK, and my passion is in science and chronic diseases. And I believe it is all about transparency, scientific integrity, and about sharing with everyone so that everyone can benefit from it. And if you like this content and our work, please do support us by liking, leaving a review, or sharing with your friends and families, or even buying a shot of Ketone-IQ at any Sprouts nationwide in the US, and the first shot is on us. Just scan the QR code and you'll get your money back for your first shot. You can also use the code HVMNPOD20, that is HVMNPOD20, and get 20% off your first purchase at the H.V.M.N. website. No, I think you pointed out a great point. And also a shameless plug here, like exogenous ketones have been shown to stop cachexia in cancer, has been published already as well. So that's super interesting. Yeah.
It's a great use.
And you mentioned andropause. When do men have andropause? And then the second question is about testosterone. I'll let you answer the first question and I'll ask the second question.
Okay, so men and women are different, right? We agree. And, there are lots of folks along that spectrum. Some are not just he's or she's, they're theys, and they, are fluid. So in my studies, which are still difficult for conventional medicine doctors to agree, it is clear that men age as well as women and become weaker. And we can just look at the example of the 25% of men who become osteoporotic, just like women, and you see them hunched over a walker. And that begins in our 30s. So men in general will begin to see changes just like women in testosterone by 1 to 3% a year in our 30s, well before perimenopause, which in women is generally in the 40s, but can be as young as 38. And women can go through menopause at about 50. But I've seen women still cycling and able to get pregnant in their 50s until 58, even sisters, where one starts in their 30s and one in their 50s. In men, it's different. And I published in this arena in endocrinology back in 2013, where I showed in 262 men, the real issue is that while testosterone drops, the brain does not pick up that clue. And in the body, as you well know, but I'll briefly describe it, there's a negative feedback loop that starts with the hypothalamus, or the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus, where a lot of the activity and kind of desires arise, both sexual desire to eat, a number of things. And that's really the master gland. While the pituitary is sometimes thought of as the master gland, the real master is the hypothalamus, which is at a higher level. And in men, what happens as they slow down their testosterone, instead of triggering the brain to make more and pulse and trigger more release, it's on vacation. And the brain starts ignoring that. And in men, like I just described, where there's early heart disease and stroke, it happens at a younger age, 20 years before. So those changes begin to show up at the cellular level in your 30s. You can see it earlier in women as well, because if they go on a birth control pill, it suppresses testosterone. So testosterone is a critical hormone for all of us, if we do it right, not if we abuse it, not if we're doing anabolic steroids, because testosterone is a steroid. So what I showed is that if you could stimulate using a peptide, which we use often in fertility, called human chorionic gonadotropin, and we use it in women when we stimulate eggs to ovulate during in vitro fertilization, because you wanted some science here, right? And I've done all of that. So we use human chorionic gonadotropin to stimulate. It acts like something called LH, or luteinizing hormone. And luteinizing hormone cause your Leydig cells in men to make testosterone. Two different kind of cells in men in the testes: Leydig cells that make testosterone, and Sertoli cells that are responsible for sperm. And in men, as they age, they will first stop stimulating their own testosterone because their brain is on vacation and it's not paying attention the way it did in their 20s. And then every decade of life, I find that men, differently than women, fall into periandropause and then andropause by 50% every year. So you start in about the 40s, or could start late 30s. And again, it's dependent on genetic makeup and family history, which can be a little different because family history is expression of genes, right? You can have a gene, but it might not necessarily express in any way. And so in men, they first begin to express changes in their 30s. Andropause becomes obvious. I think of the 30s as periandropause. Andropause becomes more and more obvious every decade: 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Believe it or not, there are men in their 80s that can still make their own testosterone. You have to stimulate, but they can still make it. At some point, men, just like women, their testes are no longer responsive. And that's when we cycle to testosterone, and we use HCG sometimes in a brief way to keep the testes happy. And then we go back. Human chorionic gonadotropin, which is a peptide, a very simple peptide that's widely used. I've used it for more than 25 years with not one side effect. So men have the benefit of slowly, almost in a linear way, going into male menopause or andropause, while women, we're kind of all of a sudden, once we hit menopause, we're done. A year before that, That was our last menstrual cycle, and it takes a year to define it. You're in menopause when you haven't had a menstrual cycle for 1 year. In men, it's different. Every decade, they slowly move into andropause, but they're declining throughout the whole time.
And okay, so my second question is about how to improve testosterone levels, and you describe it very, very nicely using HCG. Now, I know they have got, TRT, testosterone replacement therapy. They have obviously, anabolic steroids, which we do not recommend. And then there are also over-the-counter testosterone boosters. Do they work, or are they just snake oil and people should go to, healthcare professionals and get these peptides instead?
So, great question. And I've studied that a little bit as well, because they don't work phenomenally well. And if your testosterone starts declining, you know it in general. Now, not every man feels it, but most men do. And it's not actually even sexual function, because a lot of men have pretty powerful brains and it overrides the testosterone and they can function just well.
Talk about men being sexual animals.
So it's not always there's no number really that I can point to, because I've seen men with the same low testosterone, and one is full speed ahead sexually and the other one cannot function. And so it depends on where they started too. If they were used to a very high testosterone in their 20s and all of a sudden it went from 250 free, not total, free, to 100, they can feel that difference, but it's mainly energy. What's universal to everybody is that loss of energy that we begin to tire out. We can't do everything we want to do. And we usually blame it in our 30s and 40s on working too hard or raising a family or doing all of the above, right? And so with regard to other ways to increase testosterone, I've heard it said, I haven't seen proof, that working out will increase testosterone. Not my experience. It will increase growth hormone. So if you have adequate testosterone and you sleep well and you work out, you will increase growth hormone. And in fact, there are supplements that you can help encourage it, like arginine and ornithine and citrulline. So we recommend some of those if men want to try that route, because it's also good for the vascular system, like Cialis and Viagra. It actually plays a wonderful role there in terms of flooding the body with great oxygenation. And you can feel it when you work out. But Phenegeek is one such supplement that I've used to some success, but it doesn't really get your testosterone in the range that's considered optimal. And to me, optimizing, I don't even use the term, and I haven't almost ever used the term hormone replacement therapy, testosterone, because I'm not Mother Nature. I can't replace what Mother Nature does so beautifully. Father Time, unfortunately, strips away what Mother Nature does. And so our approach to each human being at the center, which is the Comite Center for Precision Medicine and Health, and we're located in Manhattan, California, Palo Alto, and actually Miami Beach, can optimize. And by optimizing, and you'll be familiar with this because of your research and work, I mean that we want the best outcome, and we look at something called risk benefit. So when we treat to each human specifically, which I think of as N of one, not one size fits all, we are looking to optimize your system while doing no harm. And picking that balance for each person is quite variable. So that's how we look at what we do. And that's why I prefer to start with a peptide to encourage men to make their own testosterone. By the way, it grows the testes also. The testes get larger as opposed to shrinking. And most men feel fantastic on it. And I think it has an effect on the CNS as well.
Yeah. Speaking of CNS, I'm going to move to the brain questions later, but I haven't finished with the metabolic health yet. But know that we're going to get there. No, I think testosterone. More and more people now, more and more men actually, they started to realize that this is an epidemic, this is a problem. There is a global decrease in testosterone levels as we age, and there are many options out there. And as entrepreneurs also are out there seeking profits, they come up with different solutions. Some may work, some may not. So it's great to ask an expert such as yourself to know what actually works. And is HCG available? Is it just available through prescription only, or is it people can buy it online, or how does that work?
So yes, you can buy almost anything online, but it doesn't mean you should. So I don't trust what I can't verify and validate. And I won't even use compounding pharmacies unless I know their history and they get approval. Because when drugs are short, and sometimes HCG there's shortages because it's used widely in fertility. And it's very important to women when they've made 10 or 20 eggs to ovulate those eggs. And that's how we help them. So it's usually a prescription. It can be covered if there's male infertility, but in general, you have to pay out of pocket. And so we provide it by prescription to men who are what we call hypogonadal. So hypogonadal means low gonadal hormones, low testosterone. What I described in the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis is hypogonadal hypogonadism, meaning that the hormones that stimulate the testes, LH and FSH, are too low and they're not doing their job. And as men age, they don't get secreted as often. And when they do get secreted, they don't go as high. So the amplitude and magnitude and frequency is what's affected. And that's in the literature and in science, something I've known for, again, since my days training as a clinical scientist at NIH in my fellowship. And so HCG is best given by prescription by a knowledgeable clinician who is trained and understands the pros and cons and how you start and what you look for. And funny stories, I'll give you one. I still remember this gentleman. He's still a client. We call them clients because we don't want people to be sick patients. But in academia, I call them patients because I get my head handed to me, right? Because you have to be sick, right? So, but we don't want people to be sick. It really destroys life. So he came in and he was just about 40 and he had a fracture of his shoulder. And he was referred to me by the sports medicine doctor because he was doing helicopter skiing. And he thought he was fine. And he said, sex life is fine. Everything's great. Nothing to worry about. So we started him on HCG. And I usually like to start high and then go as low as possible because I want to turn on the system. He called me in about 2 weeks and he said, Dr. Comite, can you dial it down a bit? I now remember what it's like to be 18 or 20, and I can't live like that again. So it's a very common finding, particularly the men who say, oh no, my sex life is great. And then we actually stimulate their testosterone because this is a powerful mind-body thing for your sex life, right? It's not just libido. It's getting spontaneous erections and it's maintaining erections. And so we usually look at all three when we talk to a gentleman and we collect information. And so I hear that a lot and I teach it to my team.
And do they go on this peptide for a long time or just a fixed period of time? And then if you go off, will your testosterone drop back?
So the answer starting backwards is your testosterone can fall again, but it can take weeks to months. And it depends on the original reason you're what we call hypogonadal. Number one cause of it is aging. Okay, so hitting your 30s, it's inevitable, but it can happen very slowly. And so some men we can stimulate for like a year or two. And I've even been able to stop the HCG, even in men in their 40s or 50s, but I can count the number of men that I've been able to do that. But for men in their younger years, like 30s or even 20s, that have had a reason to become hypogonadal, and I can give you some reasons that could happen, and it can be transient, then it's very successful. You can use HCG. It's actually used in fertility for men too, along with other stimulants for fertility. Then you can actually stop it. But generally, as aging occurs and biological aging, HCG is the first step, but over time, it could be, 5 years, 10 years. Testosterone is usually necessary because somebody, is presenting with these symptoms. They feel better, they do better. The impact is almost immediate, but in weeks, maybe a month or two. And then they want to stay that way. And when they realize that we're reversing their sugar dynamics, we're changing their lipid metabolism, they're living life to the fullest. And the quote I love the most is, I feel like myself again. And that is critically important because it undermines your quality of life.
And that very sentence embodies reversing biological age. I feel like myself again, because most of the time when we age, we feel like we're losing ourselves. and we're feeling that we're becoming somebody else that we don't want to, and we don't like the direction that we're going into, and that causes a lot of anxiety and depression as well.
You're right. And what's interesting about the work I've done is when I set up the center in New York, I started getting a lot of referrals for men. And the fascinating part about my career that I've loved is the first third, I really did a lot of work in children. And then when I went to Yale, I started in the 90s, I started women's health at Yale. The women started bringing in their partners and significant other males. And then in New York, I started getting a flood of men who didn't like not being on the game in the boardroom or the bedroom. And so my practice shifted. And at the beginning of getting tons of men referred to me, because I trained in andrology and gynecology, they would say, but we read about you and you treat women. And I'm like, no, but we also treat children and men. And now I get asked if I see women. So a lot of times the man comes in first, and then he's reversed and doing great. And he wants to bring in his partner, who happens to be a woman, because she's looking at him and saying, how can I look like I'm in high school again and feel fantastic? So
Right. No, you were right. When I read through your bio, I was like, oh, we're going to talk a lot about women's health. And lo and behold, we spent half an hour on men's health. So,
well, who's your demographic? Like what people like to listen to?
it's a bit of mix of people who just generally want to be healthy,
Fantastic.
who's very interested in metabolic health, metabolic science.
So self-quantifiers
Biohackers,
and people who
exactly,
look at
very
themselves.
curious people. And
that's a third of our population. So a third is that. Yes, all skeptical. They all think, I used to be scared when I got a call, because I talk to every person who calls because I want them to understand the field, and it's not quite understood. And when I in the beginning, like 20 years ago, I used to be afraid to talk to those biohackers, or particularly the athletes who said they were doing everything right because they're very competitive. And there was always something, because the genetics of it, how they thought about it, it was skewed. What's out there now is even worse in some ways. So thankfully you're about the science, but a lot of what people learn are just not the facts.
Okay. Speaking of genetics, this is my question, right? You mentioned earlier, people in Asia, where, when it comes to diabetes, insulin resistance, and fat deposition, they behave differently because of their genetic markup. Genetic makeup is different to the Caucasians. And Dr. Ben Bikman have been on our show, and his research has been very extensive on the different demographics and how they deposit fat. And it's either fat tissue hyperplasia versus fat tissue hypertrophy. So in your center, how do you treat each group differently?
Good question. So first, let's recognize that there's a partnership. So there's all sorts of aspects, and depending on how a person shows up, every single person gets a continuous glucose monitor. So they're wearing, which I have on my arm because I'm a data geek. I've been wearing it since the beginning, which is many years ago. I actually snuck it in from another country, and I was stopped at, customs, because they're like, you're not allowed to do this. And I showed them I was a physician, and they acted like that was okay. It wasn't, but I got away with it because I was fascinated by the fact that people could own their own knowledge about what they ate, what they drank, how they worked out. And we actually can diagnose a lot of things going on in the body with just the continuous glucose monitor. So by studying that, and we go on in a deeper way to do oral glucose tolerance tests and look at changes in insulin and glucose and hemoglobin A1C, and literally change the course of a person's life. So if they're, let's say, Caucasian, I'll use the 33 or young guy who, when I first looked at 5 of his biomarkers, I knew he was turning into his father. So he had a syndrome that I recognize as early death from heart attack or stroke. And most of the men or women in the family, by their 60s, they've suffered for 10, 20 years. And he was in that category. Simply by knowing his 5 biomarkers, I found out his father died at 60. He inherited all these patterns. But his testosterone was also quite low at a very young age, and he worked out. So we start very slowly, and we take it, if we can, one step at a time, although a lot of folks, particularly the competitive men, want it all right away. But I believe in a process in the body. It's not a New Year's resolution or overnight. And we were able to cherry pick ways that he could improve. In the Asian population, sometimes they have an 8-pack and they're doing everything right. They're extreme athletes. They balance everything. But I think there's a different genetic makeup because you probably know there are 1,500 to 2,000 gene variants that express sugar, which is why I don't, and changes, which is why I don't even want to call it diabetes type 2 anymore, because there are 1,000 types. And so in the Asian population, they have to learn to do things a little differently because they get away with looking really good even when they're diabetic, many of them, not all of them. So I'm not going to generalize. And so we might start a little differently there, cutting down on the way they eat certain foods. Because believe it or not, when I started seeing that everyone has a disorder of carb metabolism, and this is where I came to beginning in a study I did in 2019, where I studied the individuals were an average age of 30. So we had a lot of 20 somethings and then some 30 somethings as well, a couple of 40 somethings. Every single one of them, whether they look good or not on the outside, had a disorder of carbohydrate metabolism. And this one young woman who was Korean, when she ate rice, her sugar would go over 200. So I wonder how we select for the ethnicity and what we tend to eat in our cultures that would cause your sugar to be sky high when you eat differently, it would be lower. And I've come to the recognition that it's surviving, that the Darwinian need to live through a fast, a famine, cavemen, when you had to live off your own body, required that you had genes that could adapt and live off your own and hold on to food when you got it and let go of it when you needed to live on it. And if you didn't, your genes died out. So we are all predestined to become diabetic or have a disorder of carb metabolism, which gets worse when testosterone falls. And the reason for that is muscle protects us from diabetes because it gathers the sugar and it releases it when you need it. And by getting enough muscle and having enough testosterone, you're doing that balancing act that really makes a difference. So to your question, even amongst Indian and Asian folks, and I have a theory there too about why they live like this and look so good despite diabetes and usually live a long life, although there's a profile similar to what I described about the 33-year-old who's an Ashkenazi Jew. There's a group of folks like that from India and Asia as well that I recognize. But to stick with this, I believe that there's an individualized way to look at each person. So that N of 1, and there's a few people now joining me in this. Craig Venter, who described the genome. There's a guy that works with him called Nicholas Stork, and I can share these papers with you and your people who follow you, because I'd love to, share what we do. It's time for N of 1 research, and that is how
I'm happy
we decide.
to volunteer as a subject.
You got it. Then come visit us in Palo Alto.
Yeah, there you go. It's not far at all.
Have you worn a CGM?
I worked. We had Dr. Casey Means, CMO of Levels, on here as well, and we both had a CGM, and we even measured the effect of Ketone-IQ, which is the exogenous ketone from H.V.M.N, how much it lowers glucose within the span of an hour during our podcast. So we'll have a shot before, and at the end, she measured her own blood glucose, and she was shocked how much it dropped and how high her ketones are.
Wow. So I need to look at that data. I haven't seen it, but it definitely would be something I would implement if it shows that change.
University of British Columbia, Dr. Jonathan Little published a couple of papers already by now.
I know him.
That across the board, with multiple sources of exogenous ketones, we've seen a drop of up to 50 points in blood glucose postprandial. So after food, given 12.5 grams of exogenous ketones, they have
this is eating any kind of food?
Any kind of food, including like carb-heavy food.
What if you just eat a pure carb? Like, have you done oral glucose tolerance tests and tried that in addition to it at the same time?
I think he is currently running a more chronic study of a 3-month study, and he wants to see if that occurs like
I'd be fascinated by
it. And it will be interesting to look at the HbA1c, because 3 months is enough time for HbA1c to change and improve, or or decline depending on the
It's
condition?
definitely one factor, but it isn't the be all and end all. So when I see the commercials, that the Zempic under seven is still diabetic.
Mm,
Under 5.7 is not diabetic, but under five is optimal. But you can be under five and still have vast changes in glucose that we believe in a tight control there, 70 to 120. And when you're fasting, we want glucose to be 70 to 80. We don't want it 50. That's actually not good for you either. So people who run too low or too high, like over 120 or under 70, with exceptions to that, like particularly if you're an athlete, you work out hard, you have to free up the sugar, but that's different. And so we look to maintain this optimal range to reverse diabetes and heart
thank
disease.
you. Thank you for saying this. People who listen to the show and people who know me, they probably, I've talked their ears off talking about optimal levels in metabolism, because it's not about how high you get, even though something is good for you, and it's not about how low you get, even though something is bad for you. It's about keeping it within the optimal level. So thank you for saying that. Um, let's go into the brain to cover this last bit of our session, of our episode here. So you spoke about sarcopenia, about muscle loss being a increased risk as we age in developing all these chronic diseases, right? Neurodegenerative diseases are also a main part of debilitating diseases as we age. In your studies and in your experience, what have you seen with regards to muscle connection with development of neurodegenerative diseases?
And that's I love the question, but it's going to sound funny because I'm going to sound like, it's all rosy. It is. We've had one person in 20 years get Parkinson's. And you know that Parkinson's can be genetically driven. And we have many, many individuals that have a very strong genetic factors. Means we looked at the genes beyond ApoE4 for Alzheimer's and for others. And they have every relative, parents, grandparents had Alzheimer's and dementia, which I think is multifactorial. It's not just the pure Alzheimer's and tangles, which may or may not cause Alzheimer's, because some people have tangles and don't have Alzheimer's. So we don't know what we don't know in medicine. Let's be clear. We know very little. I think that we're not seeing emergence of neurodegenerative. So I really can't speak to it because it hasn't really appeared. And I have people into their 90s, although the sweet spot is 30s to 60s. We start as young as 10 and we go to the 90s. And so we monitor very closely longitudinally, and we're regularly looking at not only the testing for that individual, but how it compares across the spectrum and to see how it applies. But I think that keeping metabolism within the healthy range and optimizing it to the best of each person's ability with some guidance for it, which is what I hope Grok will bring to the public, because it will teach them how to look at their bodies and their lives and their minds in a whole new way, will make a difference because they can own their own future health trajectory. They can decide how much effort is it really to try to make the right choices. And when do you have Mardi Gras days? Do you do it once a week, once a month, or never? Because I don't believe in living life where you're not having fun. So I like ice cream. My sugar doesn't go particularly high, but if I eat a banana, it goes sky high. So I like bananas too. So I'm more accepting of fewer bananas in my life than ice cream, which is a wonderful place to be right now. So.
I know, I was going to say. So that's a great segue to talk about Grok Health app. Can you tell us a little bit more about this app? What's the technology? What are you offering?
Fantastic. So what we're offering is a prescription for CGM for anybody who joins, and getting some blood markers, biomarkers. The 5 key markers, which we've actually now know the work I've been doing, connecting the dots of all the numbers. I thought every doctor did that. And one of the reasons I left Yale to come to New York and transition, because I had been on the faculty for 2 decades, was because I wanted to meet other like-minded people. It's rare to meet like-minded doctors. And it turns out that according to Silicon Valley, this is a superpower, which to me, it seemed natural. It seemed like, why don't you look at all the systems? Because we're one system, right? Things talk to each other in our body. And so Grok will draw the 5 key ones that have 98% correlation with the outcomes we do. So that is purely research not done by me. My data was used and when they tested the 5 biomarkers and they looked at the outcomes, the match was in terms of targeted interventions that are personalized for an individual. So everybody's different to some extent. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap. I think of it as mass customization because there's so much that can be done. We're able to tell you the choices you need to make by getting a few bits and bytes of data. You answer questions that take about 10 or 15 minutes. I call it a health portfolio. So first we ask about your own health, how you live life, your sleep, your food, your exercise. And it's boiled down from the work I've done in the bricks and mortar because I know what's imperative to understand. And getting the fact that each one of us is on a path to some form of expression of diabetes, whether it's diabetes per se or Alzheimer's or heart attacks or stroke or kidney failure or eye disease, it's tied to being unable to optimize our metabolism. And it starts there for everyone. And then we take it from there. So there's exchanges and messaging and insights and interventions that we share, all virtual. So think of it as the next step to telemedicine. So having done telemedicine since I began this work, because it was in the data and I shared the data with people I spoke to, this I feel is the way we're going to be able to help everybody, but purely virtually. And that's where we are with Grok right now.
So what are the 5 biomarkers? Can you share?
Yes, definitely. It's free testosterone, which is vital for men and women. It's insulin, fasting insulin. It's all fasting, by the way. Fasting insulin, fasting glucose, hemoglobin A1C, and cholesterol risk ratio. And those 5 biomarkers will give us insight into everything, including diabetes and including what form of diabetes it might be, as well as risks of all the other diseases. Because, for example, if insulin is elevated, it's an inflammatory molecule that increases your risk for cancer. But if you marry that to what runs in your family and no one in your family has cancer, well, you might not have to worry about cancer. But if everyone in your family had kidney failure or their eyes, they became blind because of diabetes, then that's what your genes are dictating. So we can extrapolate from that data based on the work we've done at the Comite Center and the data we have. We think of the Comite Center as the living N of 1 lab, where we're able to do the whole bespoke kind of analysis. Come and visit us so you can see.
No, I would love to. No, I'm about to say I'll be excited to visit. One last question as well. I just thought of this since you mentioned like cholesterol and testosterone. Is cholesterol dysregulation connected with low testosterone by any chance?
That's a fabulous question, actually.
Thank you.
When I don't know the direct answer to that, but I'll give you the indirect observations that I've seen scientifically. So in that first study that I published in Endocrine Society and presented on it, the 262 men, after correcting for testosterone, the one other factor that improved was their good cholesterol, or HDL. And that's a very hard thing to do. You can try exercise, you can try cutting down sugar. It's connected genetically to triglycerides. And you really want alpha 1 and alpha 2 HDL to really protect you if you do have a higher bad cholesterol. You want to know the particles. You want to know if you're LP little a. There's a whole bunch of factors in there. But that's the one connection we've seen. Now, a lot of people feel that you shouldn't drive the cholesterol down really low because it can affect the production of testosterone. I have not seen that, but that's because what we do is biased because we're increasing your testosterone. So we may be making up for it in a seesaw kind of way, because I haven't seen that happen. And if you're at very high risk for a heart attack, particularly at a young age, or a stroke, or any other sequelae of low testosterone, because testosterone affects memory, cognition, your bones, your thyroid, your heart, and the pumping is due to the muscle. Muscle is supported by testosterone. So then we're going to play to what your risk benefit is. Does that make sense, Latt?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. So for our audience who would love to find out more about yourself, Florence, and about Comite Center, where can they find you?
They can find me on every social media site. I don't know if we're up yet on TikTok, but on Twitter or X, I'm at Florence Comite. On Instagram, it's the same thing. And on Facebook and LinkedIn, feel free to look me up, and I'll welcome you to my community because I want to share this with everyone. You can also look at Comite Center, and you can look at Grok Health. So we're also posting in those lines on social.
Amazing. Thank you so much again for sharing your expertise and your knowledge, but most importantly, your passion. It really shown through. And I myself got really inspired by this conversation itself. And thank you so much, Florence.
Well, thank you, Latt. It felt like minds meeting up. And so I'd love to speak more about some of the topics I'd love to hear about from you as well.
Absolutely. Maybe you should start a podcast as well.
I'm thinking of it. Would you like to be a guest if I do?
Absolutely.
Oh,
It'll be
definite.
my honor.
So we're signing you up right away.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
You're the first one I've asked. So I'm going to be brave about it, but I'm excited about it. It will be shorter maybe, but maybe I can pick your brains about what to do to make it successful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.